too soft, but Hitler sounded nice and was easy to remember. August Kubizek, the young Hitler I knew, page 40. Since the parents of Alois apparently never lived together, even after they were married, the future father of Adolf Hitler grew up with his uncle, who, though a brother of Johann Georg Hitler, spelled his name differently, being known as Johann von Nepomuk Hitler. In view of the undying hatred which the Nazi Führer would develop from youth on for the Czechs, whose nation he ultimately destroyed, the Christian name is worthy of passing mention. Johann von Nepomuk was the national saint of the Czech people. Some historians have seen in a Hitler's being given this name an indication of Czech blood in the family. Alois Schicklgruber first learned the trade of shoemaker in the village of Spital, but being restless like his father, he soon set out to make his fortune in Vienna. At 18, he joined the border police in the Austrian customs service near Salzburg. On being promoted to the customs service itself 9 years later, he married Anna Glasl-Hörer, the adopted daughter of a customs official. She brought him a small dowry and increased social status, as such things went in the old Austro-Hungarian petty bureaucracy. But the marriage was not a happy one. She was 14 years older than he, of failing health, and she remained childless. After 16 years they were separated, and 3 years later, in 1883, she died. Before the separation, Alois, now known legally as Hitler, had taken up with a young hotel cook, Franziska Matzelsberger, who bore him a son named Alois in 1882. 1 month after the death of his wife, he married the cook, and 3 months later she gave birth to a daughter, Angela. The second marriage did not last long. Within a year, Franziska was dead of tuberculosis. 6 months later, Alois Hitler married for the third and last time. The new bride, Clara Pulzel, who would shortly become the mother of Adolf Hitler, was 25, her husband 48, and they had long known each other. Clara came from Spital, the ancestral village of the Hitlers. Her grandfather had been Johann von Nepomuk Hitler, with whom his nephew, Alois Schicklgruber Hitler, had grown up. Thus Alois and Clara were second cousins, and they found it necessary, as we have seen, to apply for episcopal dispensation to permit the marriage. It was a union which the customs official had first contemplated years before, when he had taken Clara into his childless home as a foster daughter during his first marriage. The child had lived for years with the Schicklgrubers in Braunau, and as the first wife ailed, Alois seems to have given thought to marrying Clara as soon as his wife died. His legitimation and his coming into an inheritance from the uncle who was Clara's grandfather occurred when the young girl was 16, just old enough to legally marry. But as we have seen, the wife lingered on after the separation, and perhaps because Alois in the meantime took up with the cook Franziska Matzelsberger, Clara, at the age of 20, left the household and went to Vienna, where she obtained employment as a household servant. She returned 4 years later to keep house for her cousin. Franziska, too, in the last months of her life, had moved out of her husband's home. Alois Hitler and Clara Pulzel were married on January 7, 1885. And some 4 months and 10 days later, their first child, Gustav, was born. He died in infancy, as did the second child, Ida, born in 1886. Adolf was the third child of this third marriage. A younger brother, Edmund, born in 1894, lived only 6 years. The fifth and last child, Paula, born in 1896, lived to survive her famous brother. Adolf's half-brother, Alois, and his half-sister, Angela, the children of Franziska Matzelsberger, also lived to grow up. Angela, a handsome young woman, married a revenue official named Raubal, and after his death worked in Vienna as a housekeeper, and for a time, if Haydn's information is correct, as a cook in a Jewish charity kitchen. In 1928, Hitler brought her to Berchtesgaden as his housekeeper, and thereafter one heard a great deal in Nazi circles of the wondrous Viennese pastries and desserts she baked for him, and for which he had such a ravenous appetite. She left him in 1936 to marry a professor of architecture in Dresden, and Hitler, by then chancellor and dictator, was resentful of her departure and declined to send a wedding present. She was the only person in the family with whom, in his later years, he seems to have been clothed, with one exception. Angela had a daughter, Gaily Raubau, an attractive young blonde woman with whom, as we shall see, Hitler had the only truly deep love affair of his life. Adolf Hitler never liked to hear mention of his half-brother. Alois Matzelsberger, later legitimized as Alois Hitler, became a waiter. For many years, his life was full of difficulties with the law. Haydn records that at 18, the young man was sentenced to 5 months in jail for theft, and at 20, he served another sentence of 8 months on the same charge. He eventually moved to Germany, only to become embroiled in further troubles. In 1924, while Adolf Hitler was languishing in prison for having staged a political revolt in Munich, Alois Hitler was sentenced to 6 months in prison by a Hamburg court for bigamy. Thereafter, Haydn recounts, he moved on to England, where he quickly established a family and then deserted it. The coming to power of the National Socialists brought better times to Alois Hitler. He opened a Bierstube, a small beer house, in a suburb of Berlin, moving it shortly before the war to the Wittenbergplatz in the capital's fashionable West End. It was much frequented by Nazi officials. During the early part of the war, when food was scarce, it inevitably had a plentiful supply. I used to drop in occasionally at that time. Alois was then nearing 60, a portly, simple, good-natured man with little physical resemblance to his famous half-brother, and in fact indistinguishable from dozens of other little pub keepers one had seen in Germany and Austria. Business was good, and whatever his past, he was now obviously enjoying the prosperous life. He had only one fear, that his half-brother, in a moment of disgust or rage, might revoke his license. Sometimes there was talk in the little beer house that the Chancellor and Führer of the Reich regretted this reminder of the humble nature of the Hitler family. Alois himself, I remember, refused to be drawn into any talk whatsoever about his half-brother. A wise precaution, but frustrating to those of us who were trying to learn all we could about the background of the man who by that time had already set out to conquer Europe. Except in Mein Kampf, where the sparse biographical material is often misleading and the omissions monumental, Hitler rarely discussed, or permitted discussion of in his presence, his family background and early life. We have seen what the family background was. What was the early life? The early life of Adolf Hitler. The year his father retired from the customs service at the age of 58, the 6-year-old Adolf entered the public school in the village of Fischelham, a short distance southwest of Linz. This was in 1895. For the next 4 or 5 years, the restless old pensioner moved from one village to another in the vicinity of Linz. By the time the son was 15, he could remember 7 changes of address in 5 different schools. For 2 years, he attended classes at the Benedictine monastery at Lambach, near which his father had purchased a farm. There he sang in the choir, took singing lessons, and, according to his own account, dreamed of one day taking holy orders. Finally, the retired customs official settled down for good in the village of Leonding, on the southern outskirts of Linz, where the family occupied a modest house and garden. At the age of 11, Adolf was sent to the high school at Linz. This represented a financial sacrifice for the father and indicated an ambition that the son should follow in his father's footsteps and become a civil servant. That, however, was the last thing the youth would dream of. Then, barely 11 years old, Hitler later recounted, I was forced into opposition to my father for the first time. I did not want to become a civil servant. The story of the bitter, unrelenting struggle of the boy, not yet in his teens, against a hardened and, as he said, domineering father, is one of the few biographical items which Hitler sets down in great detail and with apparent sincerity and truth in Mein Kampf. The conflict aroused the first manifestation of that fierce, unbending will which later would carry him so far, despite seemingly insuperable obstacles and handicaps, and which, confounding all those who stood in his way, was to put an indelible stamp on Germany and Europe. I did not want to become a civil servant. No, and again no. All attempts on my father's part to inspire me with love or pleasure in this profession by stories from his own life accomplished the exact opposite. I grew sick to my stomach at the thought of sitting in an office, deprived of my liberty, ceasing to be master of my own time, and being compelled to force the content of my whole life into paper forms that had to be filled out. One day it became clear to me that I would become a painter, an artist. My father was struck speechless. Painter? Artist? He doubted my sanity, or perhaps he thought he had heard wrong or misunderstood me. But when he was clear on the subject, and particularly after he felt the seriousness of my intention, he opposed it with all the determination of his nature. Artist? No, never as long as I live. My father would never depart from his never, and I intensified my nevertheless. One consequence of this encounter, Hitler later explained, was that he stopped studying in school. I thought that once my father saw how little progress I was making at high school, he would let me devote myself to my dream, whether he liked it or not. This, written 34 years later, may be partly an excuse for his failure at school. His marks in grade school had been uniformly good, but at the Linz High School they were so poor that in the end, without obtaining the customary certificate, he was forced to transfer to the state high school at Steyr, some distance from Linz. He remained there but a short time, and left before graduating. Hitler's scholastic failure rankled in him in later life, when he heaped ridicule on the academic gentry, their degrees and diplomas and their pedagogical airs. Even in the last 3 or 4 years of his life at Supreme Army Headquarters, where he allowed himself to be overwhelmed with details of military strategy, tactics, and command, he would take an evening off to reminisce with his old party cronies on the stupidity of the teachers he had had in his youth. Some of these meanderings of this mad genius, now the supreme warlord personally directing his vast armies from the Volga to the English Channel, have been preserved. When I think of the men who were my teachers, I realize that most of them were slightly mad. The men who could be regarded as good teachers were exceptional. It's tragic to think that such people have the power to bar a young man's way. March 3rd, 1942. I have the most unpleasant recollections of the teachers who taught me. Their external appearance exuded uncleanliness. Their collars were unkempt. They were the product of a proletariat denuded of all personal independence of thought, distinguished by unparalleled ignorance and most admirably fitted to become the pillars of an effete system of government which, thank God, is now a thing of the past. April 12, 1942. When I recall my teachers at school, I realize that half of them were abnormal. We pupils of old Austria were brought up to respect old people and women. But on our professors we had no mercy. They were our natural enemies. The majority of them were somewhat mentally deranged, and quite a few ended their days as honest-to-God lunatics. I was in particular bad odor with the teachers. I showed not the slightest aptitude for foreign languages, though I might have, had not the teacher been a congenital idiot. I could not bear the sight of him. August 29th, 1942. Our teachers were absolute tyrants. They had no sympathy with youth. Their one object was to stuff our brains and turn us into erudite apes like themselves. If any pupil showed the slightest trace of originality, they persecuted him relentlessly. And the only model pupils whom I have ever got to know have all been failures in afterlife. September 7th, 1942. To his dying day, it is obvious, Hitler never forgave his teachers for the poor marks they had given him, nor could he forget. But he could distort to a point of grotesqueness. The impression he made on his teachers, recollected after he had become a world figure, has been briefly recorded. One of the few instructors Hitler seems to have liked was Professor Theodor Gissinger, who strove to teach him science. Gissinger later recalled, "As far as I was concerned, Hitler left neither a favorable nor an unfavorable impression in Linz. He was by no means a leader of the class. He was slender and erect, his face pallid and very thin, almost like that of a consumptive, his gaze unusually open, his eyes brilliant." Professor Eduard Humer, apparently the congenital idiot mentioned by Hitler above, for he taught French, came to Munich in 1923 to testify for his former pupil, who was then being tried for treason as the result of the beer hall putsch. Though he lauded Hitler's aims and said that he wished from the bottom of his heart to see him fulfill his ideals, He gave the following thumbnail portrait of the young high school student. Hitler was certainly gifted, although only for particular subjects, but he lacked self-control, and, to say the least, he was considered argumentative, autocratic, self-opinionated, and bad-tempered, and unable to submit to school discipline. Nor was he industrious. Otherwise, he would have achieved much better results, gifted as he was. There was one teacher at the Linz High School who exercised a strong, and as it turned out, a fateful influence on the young Adolf Hitler. This was a history teacher, Dr. Leopold Purch, who came from the southern German-language border region where it meets that of the South Slavs, and whose experience with the racial struggle there had made him a fanatical German nationalist. Before coming to Linz, he had taught at Marburg, which later, when the area was transferred to Yugoslavia after the First World War, became Maribor. Though Dr. Purch had given his pupil marks of only fair in history, he was the only one of Hitler's teachers to receive a warm tribute in Mein Kampf. Hitler readily admitted his debt to this man. It was perhaps decisive for my whole later life that good fortune gave me a history teacher who understood, as few others did, this principle of retaining the essential and forgetting the non-essential. In my teacher, Dr. Leopold Pulch of the high school in Linz, this requirement was fulfilled in a truly ideal manner. An old gentleman, kind but at the same time firm, he was able not only to hold our attention by his dazzling eloquence, but to carry us away with him. Even today, I think back with genuine emotion on this gray-haired man who, by the fire of his words, sometimes made us forget the present, who, as if by magic, transported us into times past and, out of the millennium mists of time, transformed dry historical facts into vivid reality. There we sat, often aflame with enthusiasm, sometimes even moved to tears. He used our budding